welcome to Kingston Now. I'm Jimmy Buff. Today we're on the Rondout on the waterfront to mark the commemoration of a major historical event in the history of the city of Kingston. On October 16th, 1777, it was the Burning of Kingston, and joining us today is the City of Kingston historian Edwin Ford. Hi, Edwin.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. Can you tell us what was going on in the city at the time? What was going on Revolutionary War-wise during the burning of Kingston?
Right. Well, prior to that, the year before that, 1776, the British had occupied New York City, and also they were threatening to come up the Hudson River, and they had planned for a long time. They wanted to send an army up to separate and to conquer the Patriots, really, who were aiming for Saratoga for a battlefield. So they didn't get around to doing that for one reason or another, but in October of 1777, they did proceed up the river. There were two forts near what's now Bear Mountain, Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. One had James Clinton, and his brother George, who became the governor of New York State, was in the other one. But the British surprised everyone. Instead of aiming for it face on from the river, they landed their troops 3 or 4 miles below and went up behind the forts and conquered them from there. And so they did overcome the forts and killed quite a few on both sides. And the Clintons saved themselves by sliding down the mountain sides to the Hudson River and finding a rowboat to safety. So anyway, then the ships were free to come on up. They had been told by a Tory how they could get through the chain that was down across the river at that time. And they went through proceeding, so they didn't have to break it or anything at all. They came up the river. They landed on October 16th. They came to downtown Kingston here on the Rondout Creek and the Hudson River. They landed. They had about, I'd say about 30 vessels, of which half a dozen or more were big sailing ships, and the rest of them were just barges with the troops on. And they landed 1,200 men at Kingston Point in a cove, and they landed 400 men right about where we are now, so that they could both proceed, march uptown, and meet at Delaware Avenue and go ahead. No one fired at them. There is a story that there were muskets and militia available, but there were 1,600 British troops, and that was too much to overcome. And George Clinton, who was marching up from the south, only had 200, and he got here just in time to see Kingston burning. So they proceeded up to the town. All the people had left. They had all fled. They knew what was going to happen because that's what they did in settlements. They burned them. They burned things. That was the biggest punishment they could think of. And so everyone left. No one was killed, but they torched every building and every barn and the church, the brewery, the courthouse, everything was burned by the British. As I say, the people who had left town had either taken some of their belongings with them, but they also had buried some of their like silverware, small things, in the garden so they couldn't be found. And one story says that the British plundered the town, but I find that hard to believe. The British troops are coming up. They've got a big musket. They've got a bayonet on it. They've got all their uniform. It's the middle of October. Presumably it's what are they going to carry? I mean, they're going to carry a chair and a table back down there. So plundering might have been small, but the destruction was far from small, because the stone houses burned on the interior, and the roofs burned off in a lot of cases. Some were never rebuilt. There must have been, at least in the uptown area of Kingston, over 60 stone houses at that time. We probably got 35 now. So they did do a lot of destruction and everything. And as I say, there were 115 homes burned. There were barns. There were about 107, which meant for animals and whatever. Barracks, which surprised me because I thought that meant troops in barracks. But there's such a thing as a hay barrack. And a hay barrack is 4 posts in the ground with a temporary structure over the top, and it covered over hay. And that's what they all had, hay for the winter. So all of those burned, and they must have made an intense fire, conflagration, when all of these things were burning at the same time.
You're watching Kingston Now, and we'll continue with Edwin Ford and more about the burning of Kingston when we return. Welcome back to Kingston Now. We're with city historian Edwin Ford, and we're talking about history, specifically the burning of Kingston on October 16th, 1777. What was the population of Kingston at that time?
Well, I was guessing if there were 115 houses, I think you could easily say 300 or 400 people. And sometimes, you know, they had slaves too. So they didn't even count them, so we don't even know for sure. But I'd say maybe 500 people right in the immediate area of town Kingston, yeah.
Prior to the burning of Kingston, what was Kingston's involvement in the Revolutionary War? They had sent certainly troops to fight.
Yes. Well, the main, actually they had, only from Kingston, they had a militia before the troop. And then George Clinton, who became the governor later and was governor for 7 terms, that's later on, but a little later, not much. He was in charge of all the militia in the Hudson Valley, whereas George Washington was in charge of the Continental troops, and that's Philadelphia and that particular area. So Kingston did their part by sending people to into the militia to fight. But lots of times when it came time to have crops or something taken care of, they went home. So they didn't have much control over them like the regular army.
Had the British been through Kingston before the burning of Kingston? Had they sailed past on the river?
No, they didn't. They wouldn't have done that. But there were Tories who knew Kingston. See, people, you have to think about, some of those people came from Great Britain. They weren't so sure that they wanted to break away from the mother country. And so they were hard pressed, and we call them Tories, and a lot of them fled to Canada and all that. But it must have been a hard time for many of them, because their relatives might have been back home and all that, and they did and some of them just left, that's all.
And there were native-born American loyalists to the crown as well.
There were, sure. They were loyal to the crown too.
How did that play out in Kingston? Did it affect politics? Because in some places in the Hudson Valley it was very contentious, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, the same thing. Kingston had the same thing. They had their committee of safety, and they had their parties and all that, and they met, and so those were hard subjects for them to discuss and figure what they were going to do, what part they're going to play.
After the city was burned,
yes.
We're talking 177 houses, some that were stone and walls were still standing.
Yeah.
How quickly did they come back in and try and rebuild?
Well, they started a little at a time. Some houses that are partly burned, they were able to put a shelter in the back and put up a lean-to and get themselves through the winter. Lumber was scarce, and workmen were scarce. I think the soldiers came for a while and helped to rebuild some of those, but some of them had real hard times. Others must have gone to friends and relatives outside of the town so that they could stay. But it was a difficult time, and I think it was the city of Charleston sent amounted to $3,000 up here to help the survivors to get along. And it was a very, very difficult time, and it took a long time. Some houses were never rebuilt, and others were.
In addition, it was mid-October, and winter was coming on.
Winter was coming on, and they lost, as they say, lost hay. They must have lost crops. They must have lost everything, in some cases.
Did the British ever come back after the burning?
No. That's not to my knowledge, although there were different soldiers who, following the war, did come back and stay here. So that did happen, true, but not too much. There was one story about it was not in Kingston, but below there, down the river. There was 3 men from the British ships landed on the Dutchess County side. And there was a mill there. They were going to burn it. And the farmer said, "Don't burn my mill, please." He said, "There's my daughter, my beautiful daughter back there. If you can come back and marry her if after the war." So the guy said, "Yeah, sure." But they didn't burn it. And then he did come back after the war, met her. They got to know each other, and they got married.
That's a wonderful story. You're watching Kingston Now, and in just a moment we'll come back and talk to some of the folks who do the reenactments and maybe take a sail on one of the replica 1777 sailing vessels that they maintain. This is Kingston Now, and with us is Gene Tozzi of the 1st Ulster County Militia. Hi, Gene.
Hi, how are you?
Was there a real 1st Ulster County Militia?
Yes, there was. It was the group that it was formed in the late 17th century and is basically the militia group that defended Kingston throughout the early wars, the Indian Wars, the French and Indian, and the American Revolution.
So they saw action in wars, including the Revolution?
Oh, absolutely. First Ulster was at Saratoga and was at Fort Montgomery.
And what was their involvement in the burning of Kingston? Were they stationed here, or were they out?
They were basically, some of them were in Saratoga at the time, fighting Burgoyne, and some of them were at Fort Montgomery, fighting the British down there. They won in Saratoga and lost in Fort Montgomery.
We just had Edwin Ford on, who is a city historian, and he was talking about the resistance offered up by the residents of Kingston, and there really wasn't any resistance offered. Was it just wise on their part? They were so greatly outnumbered?
The militia being away, for one, there was nobody here really except old men and young boys to defend the city. The populace knew the British were coming. They knew the fleet was out in the river. They assumed they'd stop here and took to the hills, mostly moving out to Hurley and Shandaken and away from the city, taking whatever they could carry.
So tell me about Reenactment Day. What happens for you guys?
The Saturday of the event, the basic schedule is that in the morning the British troops will be landed by the fleet of British ships who will be here. They'll be landed on Kingston Point Beach. They'll establish a beachhead and fight the militia to start moving inland. At one point, the militia will be forced to leave, and the British will start their march into the Roundout District to meet the American forces. At the same time that the British are coming right down the streets here in front of the museum and Steel House and all that, and fighting the Americans, the British fleet will be chasing the one American gunboat, Lady Washington, on the creek, and there'll be a running gun battle on the creek here. The whole battle will conclude down near Gallow Park, and that'll be pretty much it for down here. Later on in the afternoon, the Americans will stage a surprise attack on the British encampment. Of course, it's not a surprise anymore because I just told you. But they will, and that is kind of an open scenario. Mostly they are allowed to maneuver any way they want and deal with the attack any way they decide might work.
Can they win? Can they change the course of history?
No, the Americans are required to be run off.
All right. What will your participation specifically be? Are you playing Americans? Are you playing British?
We're actually playing both. For most of the day, we will be a British gunboat. Part of the fleet that will shell the beach to support the landing, and transport British troops to the beach. However, after that happens, and when we are going to portray the Lady Washington, the gunboat that was chased by the British fleet, we will change flags, become the American gunboat, Lady Washington, and be pursued right down the creek here in a running gun battle with the rest of the boats. That's the only truly accurate part of this reenactment. Like I said, the populace wasn't here. There was no resistance. However, the Lady Washington did fire on the British fleet, which had the main effect of angering them. And they chased her down, and she scuttled by her crew at the other end of the creek there in Eddyville, and the crew escaped.
The uniform you're wearing, is that a English sailor uniform?
Its uniform is really not quite accurate. There were no real sailor uniforms at the time. This was a very common way a sailor would dress in the English Navy. There were variations galore depending on what his captain had, what the stores were on board. You usually get a lot of blue wool, for instance, and everybody make blue jackets. If it was red wool, they'd make red jackets.
So are there actually red coats that we'll see on Saturday?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm expecting probably in the neighborhood of 80 to 100 British troops coming in.
And how many reenactors how far will they come to participate in this?
If we get this one friend of ours, it'll be from Maine to southern Jersey, and out to Pennsylvania, western New York.
And at the end of the weekend, all hostilities cease and you're friends.
Yeah, well, we're friends anyway. Frenemies, I guess.
Will you take us and give us a tour of the Petty Auger Mercury in just a moment?
Sure, absolutely.
Terrific. This is Kingston Now. I'm Jimmy Buff, and we'll be back with a tour of the Petty Auger Mercury in just a moment. Welcome back to Kingston Now. This weekend marks the 234th burning of Kingston by British troops, and there's a big reenactment happening all weekend long. Right now I'm on board the Petty Auger Mercury with the crew who will participate in the reenactment. I'm with Captain Dean Barnes, ship's carpenter Hank Yost, and with sailmaster Gene Tozzi. Hi guys.
Hi.
Dean, tell me about the boat that we're on.
This is a replica of an 18th century periauger. Periaugers were the workboat, ferry boat of the Hudson River. It was a very unique style, descended from the Dutch, as we have lee boards like the boats still do in Holland. And the rigging was very unusual for the time, so a lot of travelers are marked about what were these weird boats, and they were periaugers. But because they were workboats, nobody ever made plans for them. They'd go to a boat builder and say, I need a periauger. So when we wanted to recreate this, we had to sort of base it on descriptions, that there were no plans for this vessel. We all said, this is what we need to recreate. There are lots of replica bateaus and other boats, but nobody has a Hudson River periauger. So what we happen to know is there was a boat building program up in All Plaza, New York at the Capital District Maritime Academy, and it's a program for at-risk kids. And so we met with the master boat builder there and agreed to terms, and we funded a project, and it was great because we got a boat out of the project and the kids got 2 years worth of schoolwork, which they enjoyed working on. It was the highlight of their day rather than, being in geography. But so that's the story of how we got this vessel.
Was a boat like this used in 1777 during the attack on Kingston? Would it have been in the water at that time somewhere?
Well, there would have been boats in the water at the time, but the main thing is they knew the British were coming. So basically, any targets that there was people to get out of here, they would have tried to taken it somewhere else. A lot of the vessels, the larger vessels here, were actually taken up to Albany because they had heard the fleet was coming. The Lady Washington was the only warship that was here to face the British. There were some prison hulks that were still here and ended up being burned, but that was basically it as far as the boats that were here. They basically tried to get the merchants wanted to save their goods, so they got them out of here before the British came in.
So come Saturday when the reenactment starts, you're going to sail this boat. You're the captain. How many crew will you have on board?
We'll have probably a crew of 7, we'll first what we're going to do is we're going to recreate the landing of the British troops. So all the vessels will be British that morning, and we will land the British troops, and that was an actual landing point back in 1777. They landed, that was called Columbus Point back then. They landed there and marched into town and burnt the buildings in Roundout, and the other troops marched up the hill, which is Delaware Avenue today, and up to uptown Kingston and burned uptown Kingston. After we disembark the troops and they have a bit of a skirmish with some civilians on shore, is we're going to row the boats around the lighthouse, and we're going to have while the British have the street battle up here, we're going to have a running creek battle coming up the creek, and at that point we're going to switch sides, and we will represent the Lady Washington, valiantly trying to save Kingston against the fleet of 8 boats that are chasing us.
Will you do anything to make her look different as the Lady Washington?
We will change her colors. We will be flying. We'll be flying the royal ensign over there, and we'll be flying a Liberty flag in the river.
How does she sail when she's under sail? How does it? Does she move okay?
Well, these were designed as ferry boats, so they sail okay, but they're not racing boats. They're not yachts. They're meant to hold. This size vessel is rated to hold 3 tons. So you're talking about having 15 barrels, full barrels in here stacked up, being a lot lower in the water, and that extra weight would also improve her sailing a little bit than being empty. Right now, the only ballast we have is human. So if we're not making way and we need the rudder, the human ballast moved to the back, so it's movable ballast.
That's it for Kingston Now. My thanks to Edwin Ford, the city historian of Kingston, and to Gene Tozzi, Hank Yost, and Dean Barnes of the Petty Auger, Mercury. We'll see you next time.